Chance ohne Mikro. Thank you, Friedman. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. I asked Friedman to introduce you to avoid introducing myself. Kind of, that might have looked a bit hilarious. My name is Enno. Some of you might already know me. I'm going to talk about rapid risk assessment, which is kind of a methodology we are, especially my person, developed at ENW, where methodology sounds more sophisticated than it is. Background of this talk is that and by me doing so, some other guys at ENW, we have a strong focus on a risk-based approach to InfoSec discussions, InfoSec aspects, and the say experience in the world outside us that even though we keep preaching this and we feel like we have a message to deliver that it is risk-based InfoSec work, is efficient InfoSec work. At many times we find the situation that this is not the way InfoSec is handled in lots of organizations, and I want to give some insight why this is the case, what could be done about it, and I'll provide some case studies from a recent project where we try to introduce a very fast and thereby called rapid risk assessment approach. I will skip this. This is mainly here for the record of the printed material. The agenda is, I mean, obviously we need some terms and definitions. What is risk, or what do we understand as for the term risk? What is risk assessment? What does risk assessment serve for? Why maybe doesn't it work in many organizations, at least not the way it is intended to work? Where room for improvement can be identified, where the thing that we do, that we call RRA, rapid risk assessment, is different. And as I said, some case studies will be provided. First, let's talk about the term risk. Risk has different meanings for different people. The most simple definition of risk that I came across at some time, and that has some sympathy for being simple, is exposure to loss. Still, we will rapidly realize that this one can't be really used in an InfoSec or InfoSec governance process, as there might be lots of assets that can be exposed to loss. That loss can have different forms and meanings. And this might leave out some important aspects which are covered in this definition. The probability of a threat, overcoming security controls, resistance to exploit a vulnerability that results in a loss. This is a very good, very pointing definition. Problem is, it's far too complex to be used for a daily InfoSec life for a daily handling of risk, as there's obviously lots of parameters in it that have to be reconsidered to work according to this definition. ISO 27005, which is regarded as the main standard on risk management from the ISO 27000 family, describes an information security risk as a potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset or group of assets and thereby cause harm to the organization. I marked some terms in red, and those three terms will have a certain meaning during the talk. And as for the method that we use to quantify and to estimate risk, it's about threats, it's about vulnerabilities, and it's about harm caused to an organization. It's about impact. And this impact usually is regarded as a negative impact. There is a quite innovative, discussion in some risk assessment circles about a concept that we or I call a concept of reward, like not only focusing on the bad things that can happen, but also on a positive outcome. But again, this is a very innovative approach. I will not cover this. So let's keep this in mind. It's about threats, vulnerabilities, and harm. It turns out that many people use, especially in, say, common daily life, the terms risk and threats somehow interchangeably. They say, oh, did you consider the risk of an earthquake, of a flood turning up, whatever? And what they really mean is a threat. Just to clarify, a threat is something bad that can happen, regardless of the relevance. A meteorite hitting planet Earth is a threat. Still, I assume that most of you sleep well at most nights, depending on the number of small children you might have. But besides this, you don't worry too much about meteorites. That's a threat. That might not be, at least not a relevant risk. So what is a risk? A risk is a certain view on threats by some dimensions. How likely is the threat going to happen? That's a probability. If it happens, if, say, an earthquake happens, will it affect us? That's a factor that we call the vulnerability or vulnerability factor. And in case it happens and we are susceptible to the event, how hard will it hit us? What harm will it cause? That's the impact. And looking at the threat from these three perspectives, then it becomes a risk. And risks is what corporate InfoSec life has to tackle, has to work on, mainly due to the fact that resources are limited. So for somebody being involved in information security, it's not like one has unlimited resources, unlimited money, unlimited amount of time to, say, elevate the state or increase the overall state of information security. The resources are limited, so the challenge is to do the best with limited resources, and this is performed. Risk is a very important piece in those steering and governance processes. There is a 2002 published ISO document that has some definitions on risk, and that one defines risk analysis as the systematic use of information to identify sources and to estimate the risk. Throughout the remainder of my talk, I will use the terms risk assessment and risk analysis interchangeably. Kind of the same as for the perspective of my talk. This might collide with very academic or very strict definitions of those terms. I leave this aside. So whenever I use risk analysis, that's not different from risk assessment. Both I will just call RA in abbreviated form. So it's about a systematic use. It's about a systematic process to evaluate and to handle risks. And there is quite some approaches, quite some tools, quite some methodologies out there to perform this process called risk assessment or risk analysis. There is so-called quantitative versus qualitative approaches, where the quantitative approaches work with exactly defined numbers. Like the probability of an earthquake hitting Heidelberg is whatever it is, it can be figured out by looking at the past 100 years or past 500 years and looking at, say, some data from ground movements, whatever. This is supposed to be opposed to the qualitative approach that does not try to have exact numbers, but to work on a scale with higher and lower numbers to get an idea of what risk is bigger than another one. But we don't need very exact numbers for this one. In InfoSec and IT in general, usually the qualitative approach is used, as it's quite difficult, say, to figure out the exact probability of a virus outbreak happening or of a hardware failure happening. I mean, you can collect those data and try to work on the past data to kind of get future data, but there is lots of threats where this will either not work or will require an extensive amount of work, which then again might be an inhibiting factor. There is a number of methods available. The most common ones are, I'd say, Octave. And in Europe, especially in France, there is a method called MEARI. There is tools. The most common one, at least from my perspective, is CREM. So there might be ways to tackle or to perform a process like risk assessment. And as we will see, I mean, there's even ISO 27005 published in 2008. There's lots of benefits of performing risk analysis, risk assessment. And the first one is communication. It's always a good thing if people talk to each other about, say, InfoSec topics, and performing risk analysis usually means people get together, try to figure out what bad things can happen, how relevant are those bad things. And so talking about risks, talking about threats usually provides better insight into an environment, into things that can happen. And so by itself, risk analysis has its use. Usually in those what I call exercises, like people getting together, talking about risks, there are some moments like, oh, I never thought about this. And so after going through the exercise, there's a better understanding, and this might help the overall state of information security in a direct way. This kind of risk analysis, so I call this discussion mode. Discussing risks and trying to figure out what is relevant, what is not. Risk analysis might serve as a basis for decision taking. Like there is discussions within a project, should we go with technology A or with technology B? And it turns out that this question might be answered by means of risk analysis. Let's try to figure out what are the risks, to what degree are those risks, say, modified by going this way, and by what degree are they modified by going that way. And trying to find this out might help for the decision taking. Okay, we go this way or we go that way. Usually, in this kind of mode of risk assessment, that in a very strict or very well-organized InfoSec cycle can be called in governance mode. For InfoSec overall governance, it is necessary at certain points to take decisions, and those decisions are taken based on insight into risks. That's why it's called governance mode. Pretty much always, performing the risk analysis serves to answer a question. To answer the question like this way or that way, or what happens, to what degree is our risk modified if we take some architectural change. So finding out the appropriate question is a crucial part when performing risk analysis for this purpose. Like not just discussing stuff, but taking decisions with all the consequences decisions might have based on risk, on understanding of risk. There's more benefits. When performed correctly, risk analysis has the immediate side effect of documenting a process of decision taking. Risk analysis or then subsequent risk management might serve to hold people accountable. Like you performed the exercise, you came to those conclusions, you took that decision, so simply said, don't complain afterwards as you were involved in the exercise. Usually this means the right mix of people with, say, some authority has to be present in the exercise, where exercise usually means people gathering either by person or in a conference call and discussing, filling out tables, filling tables with numbers and drawing conclusions from this. And by the way, ISO 27001 strictly mandates for risk assessment. So whenever your organization tries to follow the ISO 27000 path for InfoSec management, the risk assessment plays a major role then. So that question I mentioned, governance mode, in the mode where risk analysis serves to take decisions, that question plays a vital role. And how could that question usually be formulated? There is two main examples. The first one is something like, what's the current state of risks in our environment? Let's sit down and try to find out, usually based on a so-called threat catalog. There's catastrophes that can happen, there is human failure, there's deliberate actions, there's hardware failures, there's attacks. Let's have a look at all those threats, rate them, rate their associated risks, draw some conclusions. For example, where to put the resources, which are the most relevant risks. There we have to put the money. We don't have to spend money on not so relevant risks. This is usually performed on a regular basis, say every 6 or 12 months, and uses the same threats every time it is performed. This can be found in quite a number of organizations, not so much driven by, say, the InfoSec people, but mostly driven by either risk management departments, which, depending on the industry sector, might be present anyway, or by business continuity management. And this mode, taking a threat catalog, always looking at the same threats at regular intervals, I call inventory mode. And inventory mode mainly serves to answer this exact questions. Where do we stand right now compared to, say, 12 months ago? And where do we have to put, say, future resources? There is a whole different type of question, and this is the one I'm going to focus on to some degree. That is, to what degree does the risk landscape shift if some change happens? If we introduce virtualization, what does this mean for our overall risk for a certain set of assets? If we outsource, if we go to the cloud, what does this mean as for the risk? This is a whole different type of question, and usually the threats in that scenario do not derive from a threat catalog. It doesn't make sense, say, to answer a question of shall we introduce virtualization or not to rate the risk of an earthquake. And there might be risks or there might be threats arising from virtualization, like attacks on the hypervisor that have not been covered so far in the threat catalog. So these are two completely different types of questions and different types of associated risk management or risk assessment. Before I go on, I want to summarize. There's mainly 3 modes of risk assessment. There is what we just heard, inventory mode, regular intervals, threat catalog. There is discussion mode, people talk to each other. And there is governance mode. In an InfoSec cycle, decisions are taken based on risk. Keep this in mind, please. And hopefully, so far, you could understand that obviously risk assessment, subsequent managing those risks to some degree, has obvious benefit. And it's even mandated by ISO 27001. So question is, why the hell in so many organizations this is not done correctly, it isn't done at all, it is done only partially, it is done with the wrong tools. Why is it that risk assessment as in, what I think, obviously paramount process for efficient InfoSec management is not widely deployed? And from our observations, I mean, we have been doing this type of stuff for quite some years now. I'm a fan of a risk-based approach since about 2001, when I first got in contact with BS 7799 at the time, which served as the predecessor for ISO 27002 and 1 as for the current standards. And it turns out there is a set of common problems. Usually there is resource and time constraints. I mean, this is a process. This is a process that might be time consuming. This might require some expertise not available within the organization, which had to be brought in from external parties. This might be a problem. The more prevalent problem from my perspective is usually people getting into risk assessment, like understanding, oh, this can be helpful for me and my organization. They strive for the holistic big hit, like, oh, yeah, now let's have a look at the threats. And then it turns out, well, looking at the threats, there is different types of impact. There is impact on availability, impact on confidentiality, maybe impact on regulations. And then they find out, well, there might be network-related risks, but those depend on other risk or threats, like talking about the threat of physical access or loss of power of a network switch might mean to look at the physical security of the data center at all, or the overall supply of power. So people go through it and they try to tackle it, and it grows bigger and bigger, more dependencies and more aspects, and they never get to a point of finishing a single exercise. And even if they manage to assemble a group of people for one day, so 8 hour, 5 people exercise, in the end of the day they don't have a result, they postpone, and they never really produce any meaningful, say, result. This is what happens very often, combined with the fact that people confuse the different modes. There is people who understand, like, oh, risk assessment means we discuss risk. Yes, but nice. There are others business might expect, okay, if you perform risk analysis, could you please provide results so we can take decisions on that? Oh, well, we just wanted to discuss it. And unfortunately, we have not finished the exercise. Or they might confuse inventory mode, like, yeah, we perform risk assessment. Once a year, we gather and we go through the threat catalog. Yeah, nice, you do that, but how does this help when answering the question, is virtualization, to what degree does virtualization as a technology change the overall risk? There is no benefit of it. So these are the common problems, and as for the governance mode, the one, say, mode of risk assessment that can be used and should be used as an essential element in a working InfoSec process. There is one main critical success factor. That is what I call practicability. I've never come around with a better translation. I ported this back from German, Praktikabilität. So far, I tried usability and different stuff. I've not found a better term. What it should express is, whenever one performs risk assessment in governance mode as a basis for taking decisions, not just talking, and not just fulfilling some compliance requirements that is like once a year you have to undergo a risk assessment with a threat catalog talking about earthquakes and human failures, but real practical work, taking intelligent decisions, that is governance mode. To reach this goal, it is absolutely paramount to deliver a certain result in a certain time. And this might even mean that the scope is narrowed, or the number of threats is narrowed, or the discussion is somehow strictly steered. I have experienced risk analysis sessions where I was acting as a moderator, and I told people like, oh wait, okay, I know it's lunchtime, and I know everybody of you is hungry. We won't leave this room until this is finished. And then people got back to me, how can you expect to get a meaningful result out of people, say, putting them under pressure, exploiting them being hungry? And my answer usually is, even if this result was generated with, say, unfortunate conditions, it's better than not having a result. It's better than not having any, say, transparent or number-based, as we will see, estimation of risks. So this is where the rapid risk assessment comes into play. It's an approach that we at the R&W kind of developed and use for governance mode risk assessments, which again we regard as the most important ones. Crucial is to perform so in a timely manner. What we do in the rapid risk assessment is not rocket science. We just use a very common approach, a very common methodology. The main difference to other, say, methodologies to be found out there is we do not work in the rapid risk assessment. Usually we do not work with generic threats. We focus on those threats that might be relevant to a given scenario, which then in turn requires some degree of experience and maturity as for risk assessments. But once this is given, this stuff can turn out what we think tremendously helpful. It's about all R's. It's about rapid, we focus on relevant risks, it's repeatable, and we try to stay on a, say, business reasonable ground as for time and resource consumption during the process. What we do is essentially what ISO 27005, which does not exactly describe a methodology, but ISO 27005 is based on BS 7993 and the Australian New Zealand Standard 4360. So one can get an idea what they think is a good approach, and that is an approach that many practitioners have been using anyway, which is a qualitative risk assessment. So not working with exact numbers, but on a scale from 1, very low, to 5, very high. And 3 factors coming into the overall picture of a risk. That is how probable is an event, how vulnerable is a given scope to an event, and the impact. And usually it's simple tables like this one, having a list of threats, looking at the threats with certain parameters, rating their probability, vulnerability, and impact, multiplying those numbers, and in the end of the day one gets numbers which give an idea that obviously this risk is higher than this one. And maybe some of these risks are below or above a certain threshold. Like, okay, we don't have to tackle any risks. Performing this methodology, usually 20 is a threshold very commonly used, which gives everything below 20 is not looked at all, as is regarded not a relevant risk. So it's not, again, not at all rocket science. Having some threats, looking at them from different angles, and those 3 angles are the probability. Again, usually that one is on a scale from 1 to 5, like the other parameters, where 1 up to 5 are defined at some place. It's not completely subjective, like, oh, 1 is low. Yeah, but what does low mean? Low might mean less than once in a year, and 4 might mean more than once in a month, something, some event knocking at the door. I explicitly use the term knocking at the door as in this 3 parameter-based approach with the vulnerability factor, usually looking at the probability means that one does not consider existing controls. Say an approach like, okay, there might be bad people trying to get into our data center, but thankfully they don't get in as we have a good access control. That's the wrong way of tackling this. The probability just describes how often will it happen that somebody shows up at a data center trying to get in. If there is good access control, this has some influence on the vulnerability factor. This environment is not susceptible to the threat people trying to get in. This is, some people have to get used to this, especially those, I say, old data center guys. They are sitting there, oh, but you can't leave out what we have done in the past. Yes, we can, and you will see why this is a good thing to kind of split between the probability and the vulnerability. The vulnerability gives an idea. There is that say, junction of terms, threats and vulnerabilities. Threats is bad things that can happen. Vulnerabilities are the factors enabling that the bad things materialize. Like there's a threat of theft, and the vulnerability would be an open door and no security guard. This is a concept that in itself has a lot of value and is particularly relevant for that type of risk assessment that we perform. So this vulnerability has to be rated to some degree, again on the scale from 1 to 5. The interesting point about the vulnerability is this is usually the factor that can be, say, modified or influenced on in a given environment. You can't change the world. Bad things happen. There are people knocking at your door. And if they get in, there will be severe impact. So one can't change, say, the impact too much, depending on the point of view, but let's put it that simply. But what one can modify from an InfoSec perspective or from a practitioner's perspective usually is the vulnerability. If they show up, will they get in or not? This is say, expressed in the vulnerability factor, which can, this is a fairly generic scale to be found for the 1 to 5, where 1 means there is extensive controls. So the threat can only materialize if multiple failures coincide. And the 5 is if there is any controls at all, they are so weak they can easily be circumvented either by an attack or, say, the earthquake. One tried to build a building in a way that is earthquake-proof, but research has shown that the approach was the wrong one. If an earthquake shows up, the building will break. Then vulnerability will still be a 5, even though there is controls in place. Same thing for the impact. The impact has to be rated on a 1 to 5 scale. There's different approaches trying to break down the impact on that 1 to 5 scale, as some people might try to differentiate between, impact on availability is a completely different thing than an impact on CI, that stands for confidentiality and integrity, or impact on compliance in the sense of violating regulations. While I certainly agree that looking at the impact from different angles, availability versus confidentiality, makes sense. From a governance point of view, this usually means that one doesn't stay on time, which again makes the whole effort then worthless. So there is some debate on this one, but the common sense is try to break down the impact, even if that one is from completely different angles, in one number. So how does then the famous rapid risk assessment work, which again just as an application mode of all this stuff being around anyway. The rapid risk assessment kind of describes a procedure that starts with, try to assemble the right people, might be in a room, usually One of the advantages of the RRA is those exercises can be performed in conference calls. So in a given amount of time. This requires some pre-work, which means some parameters, I'll list them in a second, have to be agreed on beforehand. And then one goes into the meeting, into the exercise, into the conference call, fills out the table, and delivers a result. What's the stuff that is absolutely necessary to do so in a reasonable way? There's mainly one discipline. Not to get into lengthy discussions. Those of you who have tried to perform risk assessments in the past, or those of you who are involved in InfoSec in large organizations, know that, say, discussions with some InfoSec people, some people from business units, some people from a project trying to bring in some new technology, and maybe you have a compliance officer in the call, you have somebody from legal in the call, there is somebody from another organizational entity in the call, and all those start discussing, have completely different terms, and in the end of the day, some conference call is over, and everybody leaves, kind of heads over to the next meeting, and has a feeling of, okay, what did we do the last 60 minutes? Yeah, we had some discussion, but did we get to the point? No. Crucial for success of what we call the rapid risk assessment is discipline, which has to be enforced by a moderator. I mean, there are some ground rules, but those ground rules apply to conference calls anyway. So, stay within time, remain goal-oriented, and for the risk assessment, governance mode risk assessment, in our methodology, the RRA, it's absolutely essential that one does not assume, oh, we can discuss this in another call. No, we can't. We have to get a result out of a given exercise. Then there has to be some agreement on the question. You might recall risk assessment in governance mode answers a question. That can be, how does the risk change if we introduce some architectural change? Is it better to go way A or B? If we go way B, which of the three given windows would be the best option as for a risk mitigating, say, picture? This question has to be agreed on beforehand, which usually happens outside the call by some key players. And it has to be written down within the, say, spreadsheet. All the stuff is spreadsheet-based. There is, say, a field that is explicitly labeled question to be answered by this exercise. Then there has to be some agreement on the asset itself. What's the scope? What kind of data are we looking at when thinking about the risks? And what are the security objectives of this data or requirements, if there are any, say, external regulation kicking in? And which are the threats we are going to cover? Obviously, for the governance mode, answering a question, in most cases, that does not make sense going through a threat catalog. Like taking the, in the appendix of ISO 27005, there's a threat catalog. There is the German InfoSec people of you might know there is a BSI Gefährdungskatalog des Grundschutzes with some 100 numbers of so-called Gefährdungen, which a high number of them might not be relevant to the scenario discussed at a given point at all. So taking this approach does not work. Agree on the threats, which is usually done by means of a moderator collecting the threats in advance and picking from some key players and picking 5 or 10 to be covered. Again, the formulation of the question, that is the crucial point. As an example, the question might be, I'll give 2 case studies in a second, and in one of those case studies the question was what are the main risks and the risk delta between hard versus soft tokens? I'll cover the case study in a second, but this is a typical question for the rapid risk assessment. The asset to be protected and to be kept in mind during the exercise was corporate network housing, and or the corporate network where all the corporate data lived, and the security objectives for the asset were quite simple ones, given the generic nature of the asset. What usually comes into play as well is formulating assumptions, like narrowing the scope. In that case, what are the main risks between hard and soft tokens? In that environment, token-based authentication was used for remote access. So one had to agree on remote access for whom, by what kind of laptops, or what kind of systems, by what kind of technology. In the given sample, one agreed on SSL VPNs having the same or better risk profile than IPsec. I believe the jury might still be out there if that is a good assumption, but still it was formulated. So it was clear to everybody involved, no discussions on, say, the value or security posture of a given protocol. And yeah, the asset, I already gave that example. I gave the example on the security objectives. This might sound very simple or neglectable. Believe me, it isn't. Think about the remote access scenario. When I got into this piece, there was lots of discussions in lengthy conference calls with lots of people and lots of confusion, and they did not even agree on which security objective to protect. There were people like bringing up, okay, well, but then what about a DOS attack against the VPN gateways, which is a valid question. But as for talking about the difference of authentication methods, hard versus soft tokens, it doesn't make sense to discuss availability of VPN gateways. If availability is a crucial point, yeah, then reconsider it. But given this asset, we had in that case corporate data, their confidentiality and integrity had to be protected. Again, last point to agree on before going into the actual exercise is which threats are going to be covered. This means that during the exercise itself, during, say, a 60 or 120-minute conference call, it's not allowed to bring in additional threats, which was, I mean, you might, in your organization, you might know the, say, very paranoid type of guy thinking about all freaky kinds of stuff happening. But what if there is somebody who rootkits a machine and replaces the RPC, the Microsoft RPC component? That is an attack vector. I heard of at Black Hat 2010 somewhere. Maybe you are that type of guy. Point is, this threat might not be too relevant. There might be threats that are much more relevant. So this might be a bit disappointing, like having somebody, but we did, there is that fancy new attack method. Yes, sir, maybe there is, but please, we agreed on beforehand on the threats to be covered by some key players. We won't discuss your fancy new attack vector here. This, again, might cause some disappointment, but is necessary to get a result out of it. So, to give you an idea how this stuff works, I'll tell you some notes about two case studies. The first one is from an environment I somehow work in, and where we brought this methodology in, which is a very large corporation. Obviously, I won't give you a name, but in their own understanding, they are one of the largest corporations of the world. So they are large. And their whole IT infrastructure, or large pieces of their infrastructure, are outsourced. They are currently, since 2 years, in a transition process from one outsourcer to another one. They have a high degree of global dispersion, which means the InfoSec people are in different time zones on different continents. And their environment can be characterized with the acronym. Some of you might know this. There is even a Wikipedia entry if you want to know what VUCA means. Volatile, uncertain, chaotic, ambiguous. Yes, maybe I'm talking about your organization here. So, reality. And within that, in itself, complex space, there was a large project going on, working with, usually in their business case, working on $1 million scale, to enhance user experience for remote access, to say, diminish the time to get email for say somebody who was not on company network from 90 seconds to 30 seconds, to enhance all types of remote access needed with web-defined services, with SSL VPNs instead of IPsec ones. And one point within this was the discussion, should we replace hard tokens by soft tokens? I assume most of you have an idea what I mean here. Hard tokens are those RSA style stuff, giving a number to be typed into. Soft tokens is the same piece running as the software on a laptop. And obviously there were InfoSec people, the paranoid ones, turning up, oh, but wait, if it's running on a PC, it's not that secure as it had been before, which gave lots of discussions, and there was a business case. If we do this, we can save $3 million a year, which made it a bit difficult, to say the least, for the InfoSec people arguing against it. So when I came in, there had been lots of conference calls with lots of players. Lots of time had been wasted with all kinds of discussions, and good and bad, and the attack vectors, and yeah, cost savings, and all the stuff. There was a kind of stuck situation. And the person who brought me in was, to some degree, asked by business, by the project, and by the business owners to prepare a decision paper. Should we replace hard tokens with soft tokens or not? Or what is the delta risk? So we prepared an RA with some key players of our process, 3 people. We had a 60-minute conference call and some email exchange, so we identified the relevant threats. And then we went into the RA itself. I'll show that in a second. With 8 people involved in a 2-hour conference call, and we managed to get out a filled-out risk assessment covering 4 main threats and their risk, their delta risk between a hard token scenario and a soft token scenario. I won't discuss these numbers. Obviously, they vary they are largely connected with the environment itself and lots of parameters. Point is, this one gives a clear indication which of the threats change as for the risk, and to what degree. Do they double, or is it just a slight change? So providing this back to the project was immediately helpful. Like, okay, look at this, look at the numbers. Okay, there's 2 things to take care of, 2 things that decrease as for the security posture. They decrease to some degree, and the contributing factors can be found here as the impact stays the same in both threats. And guess what? Business came back to us, asked like, okay, now we understand. Before you had all that foggy discussions, now we understand what are the main risks and to what degree they change. We understand that the security posture goes down, so please provide. We still want to realize that 3 to 5 million cost savings. Please provide. Give us some ideas on compensating controls. Provide some numbers, what the compensating controls costs, and to what degree they change the risk scale. So we identified some compensating controls. and had another exercise, which was easy. Same people, same methodology, same threads. We just had to tackle some of the parameters. That was an easy go, a 60-minute conference call. And after that, we got out. If we apply two main compensating controls that I'm happy to discuss offline, kind of, the overall risks associated with two relevant threads can be reduced to these numbers, which are worse than these, but still much better than those. So provided as a good compromise of realizing cost savings, while at the same time keeping a reasonable, or somebody decided on this, a reasonable level of risk. And all this with numbers in a transparent way to enhance decision taking. And this is exactly what risk analysis should serve for. A second case study, that is a global manufacturing company. Again, it's not a small shop. And one nature of their business is they have a high degree of innovation, a high amount of resources spent on research and development, which means they have a lot of joint ventures all over the world. Every year they acquire a number of smaller companies specialized on some technology which they want to get hold of. They have a lot of patents and they have a heavy participation in industry consortia. And they have a network security policy which states something like, if an untrusted network gets connected, it has to be done by a two-staged firewall, double-staged firewall. This might sound familiar to some of you. Problem is, yeah, this does not work very well in a fast-moving business. There's the question, which networks are untrusted? The industry peers or the recently acquired subsidiaries? I mean, business kept asking like, oh wait, we have 100% of their shares. Why do we regard them as untrusted? Why can't we start with the joint development process and using their development facilities just because you as the security guys tell us you want to place a double-stage firewall there with a 2-month deployment process? So business, in quotes, was not too delighted with the delays and the hassle that some stuff was brought in. And what we did, we suggested a risk-based approach. Like in case an external network gets connected, perform a risk analysis, and depending on the outcome of the risk analysis, decide if the external network is connected without any additional controls, without firewall, with a single firewall, with, say, encrypted connection, depending on the risk analysis. And that risk analysis performed by means of an RA means performed quickly, which is exactly what we did. We tried to find out who are the relevant persons. That one was a bit difficult, like bringing the right persons into a conference call, especially as the case study here was on a joint venture with a company in the Emirates, which they had some specifics as for their connectivity options and stuff, and they had a different type of organization. It wasn't like easy saying, okay, who is your network security responsible person who can tell us, give us an idea of the stuff and be part of the discussion. But we have the hope that the next time we need such an exercise, and I mean there has been another one in the meantime, this worked much faster as we had the experience of identifying the relevant persons. The exercise itself was performed in a 2-hour conference call, which went surprisingly smooth, given they had not too much risk assessment experience. My rationale for this is they are an engineering company, and engineers tend to have some familiarity with the kind of numeric, number-based approach of and calculating stuff and probabilities. So that one worked surprisingly well. It gave an interesting result. I'll show in the next slide, which can be broken down. The traditional approach prescribed by policy, introduce a double-stage firewall wouldn't have provided any protection as for the relevant risks anyway. And the business was very happy with the way how this was handled. Not going to a lengthy discussion with an associated process of deploying a firewall and filing a risk acceptance and all that overhead. It was like we tried to identify the 10 main threats. Those of you who are very accurate and familiar with the methodology might note these are not very exact threats. We had to formulate them in a way people understood them. Network connection, the new network connection leading to opportunities of eavesdropping. This is not exactly a threat, it's a kind of mixture of a threat and a vulnerability. But that left aside, we discussed those 10 points. We put them into numbers, and we were immediately able to spot where do relevant risks arise from the planned network connection, which was in the space, targeted attacks, leaving that aside as this is a special subject in itself anyway, but it turned out that the engineering data that was flowing between the two entities was unencrypted. It was exchanged by means of FTP shares, and it was some kind of prepared engineering data. But obviously, transporting this through some link in some other country was regarded as dangerous. The same turned out to be the case for violations of regulations, as salary data and professional background of some engineers had to be transferred to the Emirates, and the Emirates is not covered by, at the time, and they are still not covered by EU adequate protection as for personal data. And given it was a joint venture, there was not the instrument of so-called binding corporate rules. And yeah, so now what effect would have had a double-stage firewall had on these threats, on these relevant risks? None. Still unencrypted connection. Of course, one could encrypt that. One could say, okay, firewall with some VPN capabilities, but then again, all the discussion about costs and whatever. The crucial point was we were able to identify the relevant risks in a rapid way to understand, okay, if we do this, we have to take care of these pieces. And all this happened, I mean, there was some pre-work, but all this happened in a 2-hour conference call. There were some lessons learned. I'll skip to those quite quickly. It turned out that joint understanding of the scope and the asset is paramount. I mentioned this already, but what we learned is there is always people who have not done their homework. Even if in advance of an exercise, we send like, okay, here's an architecture diagram, here's the classification of the data. People don't read this. And then it is like one is in the conference call and there is somebody, oh, yeah, well, but what's the data processed? Yeah, you got an email on this. I can't find it right now. Can you show this? And then the presenter starts searching in some local shares, and this costs time. And staying on time is crucial. So having all this for the presenter, like it can't pop up immediately. Okay, here's the data classification. Here's the network diagram. Helps. And the same as for the methodology at all, like providing a simple diagram. Okay, we are in this stage. We talk about threats. That's a bad thing that can happen. After this, we talk about the vulnerabilities of a given, the vulnerability effect of a given threat. On a one-pager that can be faded in immediately. Turned out to be useful. Same to some degree, some underlying material to rate the likelihood of a threat. How likely is it that, say, some application gets exploited? Does it happen often or does it not happen often? All this stuff, have it prepared and have it in the hands of the presenter. That was one of the main lessons we learned of these exercises. So to summarize, so risk assessment, I hope you got the message, is essential. Many organizations fail to implement it in an efficient, usable way, and what we call the ROA, which in itself, as for the numbers and tables, is nothing special. Might be a bit particular as the approach of breaking down to relevant threads and to prepare it in a way that it can be handled in a 2-hour conference call. This one was the innovative element in it. Thank you for your time. So I don't want to serve as a bad example of going over time. Still, I mean, it's a coffee break now, so I'd say we can take 2 questions if there are any, but I'm happy, as you can imagine, I'm around anyway all the time. So feel free to approach me in a direct manner at any given point of time. Okay, there's a question back there. Yeah, I mean, it's usually, there is some, say, occasions where you can't choose them, as they are part of the process anyway. That was the case in the first case study. Those 8 to 10 players in that conference call, we could not exclude anybody, like, okay, you can't contribute and we should bring that other person in. In that situation, that was not possible. But to have a good, as for the numbers, I mean, it depends on the, say, communication skills and communication discipline, especially in conference calls of the people. I'd say more than 10 might not be helpful. It depends on the time. One can easily assign, okay, we have 12 people. We should assume there is more questions, more discussion. Even if we try to streamline this, there is always people who either not being used to being streamlined, or you shouldn't do so for political reasons. So then plan 3 hours instead of 2. I'd say 6 to 10 people at maximum is a good number. There should be some, obviously, somebody representing the information security perspective. There must be somebody, at least usually 2 to 3 persons representing the business perspective, as the InfoSec guys tend to get lost in their own paranoid discussions and whatever, and it helps if there is business people saying, yeah, guys, but wait, we want to get this deployed in 3 months, and we want to realize some cost savings. Please reconsider our angle in this one. So business, InfoSec, legal or compliance, depending on the kind of data that is discussed, this is very important. And I mean, depending on the environments, there might be different entities like an outsourcing party or business units. This is the usual mix. There was another question. Was there one? Okay. Yeah, I mean, there is, depending on the organization, finding the right people so they have an authority that the result is considered valid. That is the crucial point. I mean, it's not so, it might be easy to get people assembled, perform the exercise, but to have the result have credibility and not being like, oh, but from our business unit, nobody was there. That's why we don't accept this result. That is a crucial point, and the question. Trying to figure out the question and reminding people, like, what we do here is to answer this exact question. This is paramount. Thanks again. Enjoy coffee break, and see you all later.